Good evening and welcome to the State Library of Queensland and to the Black Opium Symposium. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Leah Giles-Peters, the State Librarian here in this wonderful State Library of Queensland. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather here tonight. Tonight is a very special night, a night which celebrates Fiona Foley's Black Opium artwork on level 4 of the State Library, and a night when we're going to be part of a significant symposium that brings together a unique multidisciplinary lineup of guest speakers who will discuss, unravel and share a time past that still resonates strongly with the present. And thank you to all of you for joining us here. I'm sure you'll find it a stimulating evening. I'd like to welcome now Professor Raleigh, Sussex, Chairperson of the Library Board of Queensland.
Thank you, Leah, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd also like to offer my welcome to the Black Opium Symposium. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, the Turrbal people and the Yagara people, and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. The location of the State Library on Kurilpa Point was historically a significant meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people. We proudly continue that tradition here today. I also acknowledge Leah Giles-Peters, State Librarian, Fiona Foley and the people from Urban Art Projects, and Donovan Hill, who worked with Fiona to integrate the artwork within the building. Lee Brett, Deputy Director General, Arts Queensland, and panel members. This evening's guest speakers, fellow board members, foundation members, and distinguished guests. The State Library is honoured to house the permanent public artwork Black Opium by one of Australia's foremost artists, Fiona Foley. Known for creating educative art and about Indigenous Australian histories, Fiona has created a work here which encourages an exploration of multifaceted truths. Black Opium was commissioned during the Millennium Arts Project, and it's an engaging comment on a significant period in Australia's past, the lead into and aftermath of the Aboriginal Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act, 1897. Developed to quash the emerging trend of paying Aboriginal labourers in opium, the Act also became a mechanism for social engineering, regulating Indigenous workers' lives and facilitating their forced removal to missions and reserves. Part of the Black Opium installation comprises 777 metal poppies arranged in an infinity symbol, hung from the ceiling of the Knowledge Walk on level 4. It is complemented by 7 mood rooms on the same level, named for their thematic content: bliss, string, silver, shrine, mangrove, gold, and slow burn. These varied mood rooms include visual, oral, and physical cues linking emotive states created by opium use, the effects of the Act on the social fabric of the time, and the environment. The legislation itself is included in the installation, locating a possibly dry document in its context. The State Library is committed to playing a vital role in making powerful and personal connections to information and knowledge to keep our collective memories alive, and we are honoured that this important work is part of the State Library of Queensland. It is now my pleasure to invite Robin Dorr, Acting Government Public Art Curator, Arts Queensland, to the stage.
Thanks, Raleigh. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today. As representative of Arts Queensland, I'd like to say that Arts Queensland is very, very proud to have supported Black Opium by Fiona Foley and Urban Arts Projects. While Black Opium was initially commissioned under the Art Built-In program during the State Library's Millennium Library project, the second stage, the completion of the mood rooms, and the publication, was funded through Art Plus Place, the Queensland Public Art Fund. Art Plus Place is available to state government, local government, incorporated not-for-profit arts and cultural organisations and private developers. This is very different from Art Built In. And it's funded some extraordinary works across Queensland, including, most recently, the works at Kangaroo Point Park, which I think you might be familiar with. Fiona's work, however, Black Opium, epitomises the aims of Arts Plus Place. It provokes thought, it inspires and enlivens our public spaces. It's perfectly located on level 4 of the State Library, where works of cultural and historic significance are held. So I congratulate the artists in the State Library for having the vision to conceive of and create a work which is as poignant as it is beautiful. And I urge you also to acquire a copy of the publication to coincide with this launch. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. And it's now my pleasure to invite Simon Farley, Ros Kidd, Anna Haebich and Andrew Gillett to the stage for session 1 of the symposium.
Well, thank you very much, Leah and Raleigh, and welcome everybody to tonight's discussion. My name's Simon Farley, and just to cover the basics first of all, this first discussion session will happen over the next hour. In the last 10 minutes there'll be time for questions, and we'll have to keep the questions fairly concise, so we do welcome the questions, but if you could, we'll also pass the microphone out to you. If you could keep the questions concise, that would be great. Without further ado, Raymond Chandler once referred to librarians as acid-faced virgins, overseeing a realm of hushed silence. My name is Simon Farley and I'm a librarian on level 4 of the State Library in the John Oxley Library. And that's the section of the State Library, as Robin said, which is a collection of historical materials pertaining to Queensland. So it's a very appropriately located artwork, Black Opium, in that you have to walk past it on the way to the John Oxley Library. And it makes a lot of comments about a certain period in our past. Okay, now, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce my panel of speakers. I'm joined today by Andrew Gillett, who is Australian Research Council Queen Elizabeth II Research Fellow in the Department of Ancient History, I can get that all out, Division of Humanities at Macquarie University. But Andrew, earlier in his career, did a BA at the University of Queensland, and he was telling me that the first lecture he ever attended was by Raymond Evans in Race Relations in Australia. Now, Andrew's BA was written on the topic of opium use in Australia, so his thesis, so it's very appropriate that he's here tonight to join us in our panel. I'm also joined by Professor Anna Haebich, who is a research-intensive professor at Griffith University, and Anna was our historian in residence last year in the John Oxley Library. She's, of course, a multi-award-winning writer, and her book Broken Circles, Fragmenting Indigenous Families, 1800 to 2000, won the New South Wales Premier's Book of the Year in 2001. Now, Anna has just let me know she's just written a novel as well called Murdering Stepmothers, which I think I might need to read. I'm also joined by Dr. Ros Kidd. Ros Kidd is the author of The Way We Civilise, which had such a profound influence on Fiona Foley that it led to the creation of her artwork. Now, that was the book was a reworking of her PhD thesis, which was based on unprecedented access to church and government files, and it investigated how successive governments controlled Aboriginal lives in this state. So I'd like to welcome all three panellists tonight. And I think Ros wants to start off by saying a sort of a set piece, but I would like to set the scene by reading from an editorial from the Queenslander newspaper that was published on the 1st of May 1880, and it's called The Way We Civilise, and of course this is the title that Ros chose for her book. And it begins this way. This, in plain language, is how we deal with the Aborigines. On occupying new territory, the Aboriginal inhabitants are treated exactly in the same way as wild beasts or birds the settlers may find there. Their lives and their property the nets, canoes and weapons which represent as much labour to them as the stock and buildings of a white settler, are held by the Europeans as being at their absolute disposal. Their goods are taken, their children forcibly stolen, their women carried away, entirely at the caprice of the white men. The least show of resistance is answered by a rifle bullet. In fact, the first introduction between blacks and whites is often marked by the unprovoked murder of some of the former, in order to make a commencement of the work of civilising them. And I'll skip to the last paragraph. In the Cape York Peninsula, the race conflict has hardly diminished in its intensity since the whites began it by robbing and shooting the blacks on the occasion of the first rush to the Palmer. No doubt Aboriginal numbers have greatly thinned, but they have not been cowed. Consequently, there is no part of Queensland in which more European lives have been lost, or where the bush is so thoroughly unsafe for the single traveller. Evidently, settlement must be delayed until the work of extermination is complete, a consummation of which there is no present prospect, or until some more rational and humane method of dealing with the blacks is adopted. It is surely advisable, even at this 11th hour, to try more credible alternatives and to see whether we cannot efface some portion at least of the stain which attaches to us. I'll hand over now to Ros.
Thank you. Yes, that was the Queenslander newspaper in the early 1880s ran a series of articles which were all under the heading of The Way We Civilise, all very similar headings. Very, very interesting given it's a contemporary account. So I've been asked just to give a brief paper which touches on the role of opium in the control of what became the control of Aboriginal lives. In Queensland, opium was a legal drug throughout the 1800s. It was purchased through registered dealers and its use was widespread. By late in the century, however, contemporary documents articulated opium on a register of race, labour, money and sex. Tonight I want to look briefly at how this rising opium alarm informed the framing of a law to take total control of Aboriginal Queenslanders, control that structured their lives into the 1970s. It's clear from the records that Aboriginal labour was critical to this state's development. From the earliest days, local people acted as guides, chopped wood, cleared bush, supplied fish and food, washed and cooked, built fences and roads, logged timber, drove and yarded cattle. By the early 1880s, there were already over 1,000 Aborigines in permanent work in rural Queensland. The usual payment was tobacco, adulterated liquor, food scraps and cast-off clothing. But just as commonly, whether their bosses were respected pastoralists or Chinese market gardeners, payment was made with opium charcoal, the foul debris from used opium pipes. Highly addictive, tobacco, liquor and opium snared compliant, dependent workers and access to their wives and children. Few Europeans were willing to endure the hard labour and poor conditions of rural employment in Queensland, and few settlers could afford the wages to retain them. As occupation intensified, there was fierce competition for this cheap, locally available labour pool, and much resentment that Aboriginal families were free to choose between food gathering, ceremonial travel and obligations, or work. To corner the labour market, Europeans played the race card, alleging Chinese employers traded opium and exploited Aboriginal women. But an investigation after complaints around Mackay in the late 1890s found that Aborigines preferred to work for the Chinese, who provided them better food and shelter, paid higher wages and paid them when due. A similar protest by the Atherton tableland farmers in 1900 was also dismissed, the Northern Protector saying that farmers have only themselves to blame for their labour problems. The note of alarm that did strike an urgent chord in the minds of authorities was the interlinking of opium and sex. Induced drug dependency and the moral disinhibition that went with it trapped Aboriginal men, women and children in a spiralling vortex of sexual disease. Whole families and tribal groups. Contemporary estimates suggested 1,000 deaths during the 1890s alone, were lost to endemic syphilis, gonorrhoea and physical degeneration. In the early 1890s, Yarrabah missionary Ernest Gribble found that many of the Aboriginal children around Cairns were already addicted to alcohol or opium, and young girls were prostituting themselves to feed their craving. Commissioner Archibald Meston wrote in 1896, and I quote, "Opium apparently takes complete possession of the Aboriginal to the paralysis of mental and physical faculties, the total destruction of energy and willpower, and the annihilation of all sense of manhood and womanhood, self-respect, shame, virtue, honesty and veracity." Overwhelmingly, it was the Chinese who were blamed for supplying the drug and demoralising the Aboriginal race. But Meston found, and I quote, "There are many white men who give it as the only agent which will induce them to work," unquote. He was disgusted that these men of, as he called it, position and reputation, contemptuously flouted police directives banning the supply of opium to Aborigines, their close links to local judiciaries guaranteeing token penalties. It was on the rising tide of anti-Chinese sentiment that the Queensland Government passed the Aboriginals Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act in 1897. Taking note of electoral concerns, the government made it a criminal offence to supply liquor or opium to Aborigines. And taking note of the immeasurable economic value of a cheap captive labour force in the rapidly developing colony, the government took control of all Aboriginal employment, designating the senior police officer in each district an Aboriginal protector, to negotiate compulsory work contracts, manage wages and nominate any person or family for permanent removal to a government reserve. Controls over Aboriginal lives were easily enforced, but controls over opium exploitation were another matter. Restrictions were simply defied by Treasury, which was keen to protect import revenue equivalent today to $2.5 million. Treasury actually invited dealers to apply for trading licences in northern ports, such as Cooktown and Cairns actually boasted 2 wholesale and 8 retail opium outlets in 1899. This was after the Act to restrict it. On Thursday Island, it was said that the opium provisions of the 1897 Act had been officially suspended. In this context, then, it's not surprising that in 1901 opium continued as the wage of choice in the north and was said to be as common as sugar in the west. The opium alarm was officially expressed in terms of the degeneration of the Aboriginal race, but records show the underlying concern was with the associated contamination of the white race. The removal of 51 people from Maryborough to Fraser Island in 1897 is typical. They were publicly identified as opium smokers, but what actually triggered their removal was the prevalence of venereal disease among white youths, infected by girls the police described as mere children, who had been, as they said, hawked around for purposes of prostitution. It was only after 1906, after intensive lobbying in the federal arena by Queensland's Chief Protector, that opium importation was banned except for medicinal purposes. In my view, the opium alarm of the turn of last century operated as a signifier of white exploitation. Opium was exploited to eliminate competition by Chinese employers for Aboriginal labour. It was exploited, including by prominent townsmen, to hold a subservient workforce. And it was exploited to allow free sexual congress, including with children. In fact, parliamentarians in 1901 successfully argued that no criminality should attach to intercourse with Aboriginal girls if they had reached puberty. On the grounds, they said, that they ripened faster than white girls and that the sexual maturity of children of 9 or 10 years could easily be mistaken. That was their words. Controls over labour and female sexuality were harnessed from the early 20th century to feed what authorities described as an insatiable demand for domestic servants that initially included children under 12. Because of their sexuality and instead of convicting white assailants, authorities transported far more Aboriginal girls and women to reserves than males. And then, to feed the labour market, authorities contracted back into that risk environment as many girls and women as possible, including the much sought-after girls fresh from school, despite continuing reports of assaults and pregnancies. In a scandal in 1934, the Chief Protector decided that the moral welfare of the girls was less important than the financial gain of maintaining access to their wage bonanza and avoiding the cost of supporting them safely on the settlements. On that note, missions generally refused to let girls and women go to external employment, despite government pressure to exploit this revenue resource. The Queensland Government was still contracting girls to employment in remote areas in the late 1960s, as well as their sisters, mothers and aunts. During the 19th century, thousands of Aboriginal families were trapped and destroyed by introduced opium dependency. During the 20th century, thousands of Aboriginal families were trapped and destroyed by the imposed dependency implemented on the back of the opium scourge. The word opium was dropped from the legislative title in 1939, but the controls over Aboriginal lives, work and wages continued into the 1970s. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Ros. I was just wondering if the other panellists had any impressions they'd like to share about the Act, the Act that's so central to Black Opium.
Well, if I could start. Yes. I first came across the 1897 Act in the context of research I was doing in Western Australia on the Aborigines Act, which was the prime legislation there for nearly 70 years. And you may or may not know, but that Act was based on the 1897 Act, as was legislation in South Australia and the Northern Territory. The Chief Protector of Aborigines, Mr Roth, was invited over in 1904 to conduct a Royal Commission, and his recommendations, which were based on the implementation of the Act here, were the basis of the West Australian legislation. And so I was familiar with this a grid of control that was rolled out across Aboriginal communities in Western Australia and also in Queensland. And looking at the 1897 Act, I was aware of that process of I guess, dividing Aboriginal populations to people who were to go inside institutions to be kept there because they were needy in some way, because they were children who needed to be trained for domestic service, as Ross was saying, or because they were adults who were not working, or they were playing up in their local community, or they were sick. For whatever reason, it could be really any reason, were sent off to reserves and controlled there by superintendents. And I was familiar with the processes of removing people to those areas. Also, I was familiar with the controls over people who were on the outside, and particularly in relation to employment and where they could live, and really for everybody, the controls over every aspect of their lives, down to the most intimate aspects of who they could marry and the right to bring up their own children. But what I was surprised to see was so much about opium, because in the West Australian Act there was one little mention. When I look back just the other day, back to the report of Roth's Royal Commission in Perth, there was just one little comment he made. He said, well, you should include a clause about opium because you don't have a real problem here yet, but you will because you have Chinese people here. So I thought that was quite interesting. So looking at the 1897 Act, opium is in the title, as we know. It takes up a discussion of opium takes up a very large part of the opening preamble to the Act, and it's mentioned in it's about 7 of the sections of the 33 sections in the Act. So it's very prominent, and the penalties that were to be to be given to people who supplied Aboriginal people were double those of suppliers of alcohol to Aboriginal people. So you could be sent to prison for 3 months, or you could have a fine of £100 imposed on you. So it was again, the penalty suggested the significance of that, of opium. But what surprised me, and this sort of was drawn to my attention by a colleague at Griffith University, Dr. Jonathan Richards, was that there was also a mention of relation to non-Aboriginal people and opium already in the preamble to the Act. But then there are also sections in the Act that specifically mention and prohibit the supply of opium to non-Aboriginal people. And I thought that was another very interesting aspect of the Act, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later, and I'll hand over to Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. As Anna mentioned, the 1897 Queensland Act has importance outside Queensland because it was a template for the Western Australia 1905 Act and also the South Australia Act for Control for the Northern Territory as well. And it's a template not only in regard to the actual system, the Aboriginal Reserve System, but also for this whole rhetoric of justification through opium. If you track through the parliamentary debates leading up to the Queensland Act, you get the same arguments repeated in both the Western Australia and particularly the South Australia Act as well. So the whole justification for it is developed here in Queensland first. The Act is not quite the first Australian attempt to restrict drug use. South Australia, a couple of years earlier, had in fact brought in some legislation, which was probably a dead letter, to restrict opium for non-medical use. But it hadn't at that stage been connected as being an Aboriginal issue. It was a race relations issue, but it was a Chinese issue. Sometimes the opium connection, the title is unusual. Aboriginal Protection and Restriction of Sale of Opium Act. It is unusual to have two things combined like that in legislation at this time period. In fact, Simon mentioned I studied with Ray Evans. I'm really glad to see there's a Ray Evans fan club here. His very first lecture mentioned this act, and it was the unusual title that drew my interest to looking at this. But the extent to which the opium clauses initiated the act, and the extent to which they were a rhetorical device, is something that needs to be looked at very, very carefully. There are sometimes the act is simply described as, at least intentionally, even if it's ill-intentioned, as a humanitarian response to a situation that needed to be addressed, to widespread drug use, inevitably with the Chinese population being used as scapegoats for that. When you start looking into the lead up to the Act, that falls away fairly quickly. The Act was strongly influenced by this chap called Archibald Meston, who was a bit of a ne'er-do-well who worked his way into influence with the Home Secretary at the time, was influential in the creation of the Act, and then went on to be one of the first Aboriginal protectors after the Act. Now, Meston brought himself to the attention of the Home Secretary by writing a report on the conditions of Aborigines in the mid-1890s. The Home Secretary was so impressed by this that he then commissioned a formal report again from Meston, and that report was influential in the drafting of the 1897 Act. So Meston wrote two reports. In the first one, he made no mention of opium whatsoever. The second one, which was written only the following year and which fed directly into the Act, listed a number of situations that need to be addressed in Meston's point of view, but opium was the leading one. So there's this very sudden change in attitude. And as Ros says, the Act, when it actually came into force, was certainly used to control the lives of Aboriginal populations. Was it used to control drug use, opium smoking use? Well, not very much, and it became a dead letter very quickly. When restrictions on opium use came in 1906, it was in response to the new Commonwealth government bringing in a ban, which in turn was a response to an international movement to ban opium that was was in fact the historical successor of the anti-slavery movement. The Chinese inevitably end up being the scapegoat in this discussion, and that really needs to be ventilated. It would be wonderful to have a full Chinese history of colonial Australia using original Chinese documents, and there's been some work done on that. It would be a difficult thing ever to pull together to assemble the materials, but it really is something we need for all sorts of reasons, and in particular for this. We tend to depend for our understanding of the social history of the Chinese community on quite a lot of hearsay coming out of newspapers, memoirs, parliamentary debates, that sort of thing. In other words, very much outsiders looking at the Chinese community. But one of the things which is striking in discussions at this time is that at exactly the same time that there are these concerns about Chinese exploitation of Aboriginal communities, or at least blame being put on Chinese communities, we seem to have fairly strong evidence that, in fact, opium use in the Chinese community within Australia was dying out, was ending up. This is kind of interesting because at the same time opium use back in mainland China was, if anything, increasing. But there's quite a few comments right through the whole of the east coast of Australia, at any rate, indicating that the younger generation of Chinese people, either coming from China or second generation, third generation within Australia, mostly coming from overseas, of course, were giving up opium. Quite a few merchants, the opium smoking trade was controlled by Chinese merchants who had often run the opium dens as well. Quite a few Chinese merchants in the 1890s were no longer importing smoking opium and were no longer running opium dens. This was not something that was completely wiped out, but there was, to observers in the white community and the few bits and pieces we get out of the Chinese community, it seems that opium smoking was kind of becoming passé. And it was in the 1890s and the early 1900s, it was identified with the older Chinese community in particular. So in fact, the Chinese community seemed to be giving up the opium habit, which wasn't happening back in mainland China, but at the same time, the whole rhetoric of Chinese abuse of Aborigines through opium was being built up. The relationship between that and reality is very, very complicated. You know, there is certainly clear evidence of opium coming to Aborigines being used for labour purposes. And that opium, by and large, is probably sourced from the Chinese community because it's this opium ash, as Ros said. In the Chinese community, people smoke opium in the opium pipe over the flame. In the Aboriginal community, they're using the ash, which is the residue, what's left over after the smoking. That's opium that's being used presumably in the Chinese community in Australia, although it was actually imported as well and then passed on. So the situation is very complicated, and we're barred by not having sources coming out of the Chinese community or out of the Aboriginal communities, or not having a wide range of them, which give us a very clear picture. But we can be fairly confident that the scapegoat rhetoric of an exploitative Chinese community enslaving Aborigines is not the only reality, and is something very different happening within the Chinese community itself.
I'm fascinated by the figure of Archibald Meston. You started to touch on him as a bit of a rogue, jack of all trades. He frames the 1897 Act very much in terms of benevolent necessity, but people like him must have come up a lot against the government. The Treasury was taking so much money from imports of opium into the country. I wonder what the parliamentary debates were like at the time as this piece of legislation was going through. Anna, do you have any?
Well, I had a look at the 1901 Act, debate on the 1901 bill, and Ros has already mentioned a really extremely disturbing and distasteful debate about young girls and examples about young girls to the age of 6 being violated by non-Aboriginal men in the most horrific ways. It's awful reading. But the debates that I was focusing on was about permits for employment, and in debates in Western Australia, most of the debates were all about employment. It was quite a different thing happening there. all of this was about opium and Chinese and the members for the North in particular demanding that Chinese employers be prohibited from employing Aboriginal people altogether. It was a very unruly, very untidy and emotional debate, and it's hard to sort of condense it down into a few little sentences here, but really I was very shocked. It was such a cynical exercise in politicians, particularly the Labor politicians from the North, manipulating the tragedy of Aboriginal opium addictions for their own political ends. And really what they were doing in all of their rhetoric was they wanted to stop Chinese people employing Aboriginal people. It was really all about white Australia and fears about white Australia. They wanted to keep the economy white. They wanted to protect white employers, the working conditions of white workers, and, as both other speakers have said, to keep the race pure and white, and they were very opposed to race mixing. And there was another line too, that they were really shifting all the blame for the terrible conditions of Aboriginal people in the North or other parts of the state onto Chinese employers who were giving them opium. The doomed race was in fact the fault of the Chinese people. And the terrible thing was that they won the debate. So the clause was added that alien Chinese, Aboriginal Chinese aliens, something like that, some strange wording, were prohibited from employing Aboriginal people.
Just got my eye on the time. It's ticking by rapidly. So I just wanted to read a piece that's in the last room in Black Opium, which is called The Southern Queensland Aboriginals, in which Meston is before the Legislative Assembly, before a committee, and he's quoting figures to the effect of, in the Maranoa, he says 50% have died of the cause of smoking opium in the last 6 months, and he says there are 1,000 deaths that can be attributed to opium in the decade. Are those sort of mortality figures, where's he getting those figures? Are they justifiable? Are they correct? Or do we have to take into account a far more wide-ranging sort of source of reasons for those deaths, such as disease and so on?
I think certainly if you look at the early part of his 1896 report, which preceded the Act, he gives horrendous figures for the decimation in its truest sense, down to 1/10 of the people or something like that, in many of the areas, in the northern areas in particular of Queensland, and particularly in coastal areas where lots of Aboriginal men and women were taken onto the ships for the bêche de mer and the pearling trades and badly treated. Meston was a racial purist, there's no doubt about it. But in the 1896 Act, where he's talking about these devastating numbers, and also quite clearly, and Mr Windshuttle should perhaps read it, quite clearly stating that just the wanton slaughter of Aboriginal people by whites in the area, moving into the areas and beholden to nobody in clearing Aboriginal people off their properties. So you had that whole rhetoric in the 1896 Act without a particular mention of opium, as far as I remember. And it's interesting that once opium became... Meston was an opportunist, so perhaps he could smell what was the way the wind was going. He said, if I can pin opium on this, I can get this great protecting regime that he was after, this racial control regime. I can get that through Parliament. He did stand for Parliament in the North and failed. He failed at many of his professions and finally failed at being a Southern protector and was kicked out. But I think that opium was used as the vehicle for these racial changes and these racial controls. And I think, as Anna said, when you look at the debates and you think about what it is they're actually saying, that's fairly clear. And I think probably that whole 1,000 people, it would not, I would think, be purely from smoking the opium, but the sickness and then the sexual abuse and the sickness that came from that would be very much part of it. The inability to hunt and get your own food, which had sustained people for thousands of years. The whites moving into the areas, Walter Roth, who became Chief Protector in 1904, said it is illegal. It is quite illegal for the pastoralists to hunt Aboriginal people off their lands. He said it is against the law, but it was happening. He said the whites move in, they take over the watercourses, they take over the fertile land, and they kill any Aboriginal person who is on those areas, and so people got more and more marginalised. And I think this all fed into that horrendous death toll.
Could I throw in two quick responses to that? And just following up on the points, I think it's entirely correct to say that opium is used as a device, and in fact, I'd say with the Act itself, it's probably specifically a parliamentary tactic to get it through. Something that's worth bearing in mind and background to this, which Ros brings out very clearly in her book. This is, in fact, the second attempt in Queensland to impose a regime to control Aborigines. There had been a previous system of Aboriginal reserves established in the 1870s. It wasn't as formal. It was under the oversight of the government, but there weren't direct government officials running it. And it failed because there was a lot of opposition to it. There was opposition primarily, you make the point, to land that could be farmed being put aside for humanitarian purposes. So that system had failed. There was opposition to doing anything for Aboriginal people, and as a tactic, opium served to help introduce something which had already been trialled once and then had failed. So it's definitely worth noting that in the debates there was opposition to bringing this in, and in fact there had been a previous attempt which had fizzed out altogether. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind is we talk about opium as the great demon because it was the first drug that was demonised, and when we talk about drugs in harmful sense, all of our modern ideas of harmful drugs come out of opium itself. And opium certainly has got a terribly murky history with the importation by the British out of India into China, the Opium Wars, the first great trade war, etc. But it's worth bearing in mind that opium has not always had that evil reputation, and specifically in 19th century China, opium was not regarded as something which was intrinsically harmful unless used to excess, any more than alcohol was in 19th century Australian society. And the whole demonising of opium, which isn't to say opium was harmless, but the whole demonising did come out of something that was imported into the Chinese debate, particularly from the British Protestant movement. So we have to step back even from our assumptions that opium is intrinsically harmful. Yes, there certainly were many cases where it could have been, but Chinese society ran for a long time with very high proportions of opium use, and it was not necessarily a dysfunctional society. The other thing specifically about Aboriginal use, as Ros mentioned before, as I mentioned, most of our reports indicate that Aboriginal people are not smoking opium. They're not getting fresh imported opium and smoking it. They're getting this residue, which is potentially could be more harmful. The thing about opium, smoked over a pipe, is that most of the narcotics is inert. That is, only a very small amount of the chemicals which have narcotic effect actually go up in the smoke and are inhaled. Most of it stays in the bowl and becomes a form of ash. When the ash is mixed up, then it's a much more powerful drug. In fact, as powerful as the form of opium that was used as the most common medicine by European society, including Australian colonial society. But our records of Aboriginal use indicate that it was most commonly used in a social setting. So this ash, which is potentially quite a strong drug, was dissolved in a fairly large tub of water and then shared around a family group or whatever. Now, we don't have very good descriptions of the social function of this use of opium, but it's interesting to note that we're not getting descriptions of addicts holed up by themselves in our modern image of drug use. We're getting indications of a social sharing of the drug. Again, we have to step back and think, how does that picture fit in with these images of this destructive drug wiping out 1,000 people at a time? The picture is very complicated. It's not necessarily harmless and all the rhetoric of people like Meston, etc., being false, but there are certainly many different things operating, and drugs, like any other thing, having different functions in different social groups. Opium used in Aboriginal communities does clearly seem to be used in a different way from the way it's used in the Chinese communities, or for that matter in the white communities that used either medicinal opium or the small proportion that smoked opium.
Or the crazed poets of the Romantic period writing their poetry in their opium haze.
I have to tell you, De Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Addict, which is about a totally different sort of opium use, in a 1891 New South Wales parliamentary debate, a parliamentarian who was concerned about this issue reported that he had chunks of De Quincey's visions, his dream visions from opium, translated into Chinese and read to opium smokers in the Sydney Chinese population, and they laughed at it and said that's nothing at all of what opium is like. Nice little intercultural thing there.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'll throw open to questions now. So does anybody have a question for the panel? No questions? If there are no questions, there's one... Oh, there is a question. Just the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thinking that perhaps a cynic might draw a parallel between the exploitation of Aborigines' addiction to opium in the late 19th century to intervene and regulate them with the use of allegations of sexual abuse and drug abuse in remote Aboriginal communities in the 21st century as an excuse to intervene and regulate Aboriginal lives in the Northern Territory and other places. And I just wondered if you had what you would say to such a cynic.
Well, I mentioned in passing before this whole alcohol, demonising an alcohol scare. When it's applied to an Aboriginal community, when it's a concern in an Aboriginal community, and it is a concern in many communities, it's something wrong with Aboriginal people not managing themselves really effectively, with a drug. And yet we have almost the same level of concern with binge drinking in the white community, with people falling out of pubs and belting one another up in the streets in all the major cities. I have sons who are in the 30s and 40s, and it's this whole concept, not that they're doing it, but you're very much aware of it. And yet, where is the debate about the failure of the white community, somehow culturally and genetically? It's not there. It comes down to we need to teach people that wiping yourself out with alcohol isn't good. We need to strengthen individuals to better self-control. We need, as families, to do it better, and we probably need some changes of laws, namely not selling alcohol till 5 a.m. But it's not a racial thing, is it? And yet somehow those same discussions, they're a completely different set of discussions, it seems to me, for what looks like a very similar problem. And I think it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting how we work through this whole booze scare, which is absolutely real. And I wonder, well, we went through the smoking scare. Are we going to end up with limited drinking? I hope we keep a bit of it, but I don't know. It just seems to me a very similar thing with two different glasses on.
There's also the welfare payments scare. So you might, say if you see the opium restrictions as a way of trying things out first on Aboriginal people and then gradually extending that to the rest of the population, well then we've seen the welfare controls introduced in Aboriginal communities now, and everybody's talked about that, and now gradually they're starting to introduce that for non-Aboriginal Australians as well. So if it had been the other way around, I think there would have been a lot more upheaval.
I think so.
Thank you. I'll just take one more question. We do have to do a quick change then to Ray.
Turned on. I just wanted to make a comment actually about how this opium actually got to Australia, and I think That goes back to the Opium Wars, and before that, where the British were exploiting the opium trade into China. And early in the piece, before the British got involved in it, China was only importing about 200 chests of opium a year, and that finished up in the late 1830s to about 40,000 chests of opium. So it escalated immensely, and there were about 2 million Chinese addicted to opium, and it was the Chinese authorities who saw what was happening to their citizens, and this trade was illegal because it was a prohibited import into China, that they confiscated or got the British to hand over the opium, and they destroyed, I think it was 29,000 chests of opium, and that precipitated the Opium Wars, where Britain defeated China and they extended Hong Kong, but all these Chinese had been addicted, so that's why we had it. And then later here, in the 1880s, you had some of the prominent Chinese citizens actually petitioning the government to ban the import of opium into Australia. But the government wouldn't do that because they were going to lose revenue from it, so nothing happened.
Actually, Annie, if you could just flick down a couple more images, and I know we're finishing up, exactly what the gentleman was just speaking about. Yeah, one of the leading anti-opiumists from Sydney.
Thanks for those comments, Ray. Right, we'll do a turnaround now. So I'd like you all to thank our panel, Dr. Andrea Gillett, Professor Anna Haebich, and Dr. Ros Kidd. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to do a changeover now and have Allison Kubler, who's going to facilitate a discussion with Fiona and Louise. Welcome.
My name is Allison Kubler and I'm facilitating the panel this evening. I'm a freelance curator and writer. I'm Associate Curator at the University of Queensland Art Museum, and together with Louise Martin-Chew, I'm a Director of MCK Art Consulting. I have worked in museums and galleries for some 15 years, and it's been my very great pleasure to know Fiona for several of those. We have, of course, tonight Louise Martin-Chew as well, who is a writer and curator with over 20 years' experience working in Australia. She has written for The Australian and many important journals. She's also written several books, the most recent of which is Blood Language, about the work of Judy Watson. And she, as I mentioned, together we have a consultancy, and MCK Art specialises in looking at cultural connectivity. We work in art, fashion and culture more generally. And of course, the most important guest here tonight is the very wonderful Fiona Foley. And it's actually quite difficult to introduce Fiona because she has a very large CV, which, you know, to put it very plainly, I think you would agree that she probably is one of the most important artists in this country today. And certainly in terms of public art in this country, Fiona has really made the most important artwork that exists. And I'm happy to say that I think Queensland has the most important public art in Australia as well. And indeed, further to that, the State Library now has really probably the most important artwork, aside from Witnessing to Silence, which Fiona also made. But of course, Fiona is an artist who has had a very long and prolific history working in Australia, but she's also had significant international recognition as well. And she is one of our best recognised Australian artists, although people don't really know that. But she's exhibited abroad many times and is very well respected. And most recently, she was the subject of a major survey of her work called Forbidden, which the Museum of Contemporary Art and the University of Queensland Museum co-curated. And that opens next week at the University of Queensland Art Museum. So you'll be able to go and see that survey, very significant survey of Fiona's work. And Louise and I both contributed to that catalogue as well, and I know Fiona will be signing those later this evening. But I would just like to take this moment to thank Fiona for her amazing artwork for Black Opium and the rooms. And maybe we can just quickly have a round of applause for Fiona.
Thanks, Alison. I'd like to acknowledge the Jagera and Turrbal people whose land we gather on today. I've written a little paper and it's titled Queensland's Legacy of Remembering and Forgetting. It's intrigued me for a long time, this notion that one race of people can act, speak and believe that they are superior to another race of people. It was an experience that I had never felt before until I first went to school in Queensland. Not that I was superior, but conversely that I was inferior. As a 5-year-old child, I was made to feel different because of my race. And it was these very attitudes that have intrigued me for a long time, because at the core of it, I do not accept that white Australians are superior to any other race in this country. To try and understand these attitudes of racial superiority has taken me into an area of research, from Queensland's expansion north to the treatment of Aboriginal men, women and children. It's been a long process and one of self-education through reading many books. What has been persistent in this continent is a failure of imagination, a failure to think that there are multiple histories in this country, a failure to think that the only way Aboriginal people can exist is to be assimilated, a failure to remember the positive contribution that Aboriginal people have made through their labour to the economic growth of Australia, an intellectual failure to imagine that non-English speakers can only be assimilated into white Australian middle-class values. Chinese Queenslanders who have lived in this state since 1848 do not present in our local consciousness. History has conveniently forgotten them, or at best assimilated them into the dominant narratives of the gold rushes. Similarly, there is a pervasive amnesia about Aboriginals who were discussed and debated by Queensland parliamentarians, where state laws were drawn up and newly appointed administrators like Archibald Meston, whose reports were acted upon, as were police and clergy, who also played a part in the everyday lives of Aboriginal men, women and children, running concurrently at a time when white Queenslanders were heavily reliant on Aboriginal labour for their own survival. Upstairs is a room at one end called the Slow Burn Room. It's really a snapshot in time when Archibald Meston implemented segregation between the races on Fraser Island to ensure racial purity. Although bachelor land, many Aboriginal people were removed from 25 different mainland localities and relocated to the island. The Act had been introduced in 1897, and yet we can see the sale of permits well after that date. In this case, in 1904, Mackay received 5 licences, Maryborough 3, Brisbane 16, Cairns 14, Cooktown 20, and the list goes on. No one spoke to me about the Aboriginal Protection and the Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act. No one mentioned its 33 sections or its subsequent amendment in 1901. I read about it in a publication, The Way We Civilise, and through a handful of other authors like Raymond Evans. There has been a complicity within white society to forget about their black neighbours, and it continues to be an ongoing challenge for me. Once Aboriginal people have been written out of a location or a particular history, it's very hard to write them back in. Therefore, I largely make work to remember the past. Working in the area of public art is a world where I brush up against ingrained attitudes. I usually find people fall within 2 main camps and occupy 2 very different positions. I like to term them the contemporary colonialist or the progressives. I come across a lot of ingrained fear. It sounds silly, but it's a fear to articulate another history in Australia, a fear of telling Queensland's Aboriginal history, or Mackay's South Sea Islander history, or more recently, to quote Paul Keating's famous Redfern speech. Although grounded in fact, there continues to be a clumsy denial that it either didn't occur or a papering over of history is required. The concepts put forward for the State Library of Queensland were embraced wholeheartedly. There was no tussle over the premise, as there has been on other major public projects of mine. I was allowed to talk about opium use in Queensland and its many facets through the objects and documents proposed for the suite of rooms and the ceiling. The client did not censor the piece in any way. This was the greatest gift that the staff at the State Library of Queensland could have given me, and it's that freedom to think and execute the work independently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Well, I think maybe that's a good place to start off talking about it, really, because I think one of the important things to reiterate is that document is held within the State Library of Queensland, that document that has started all of this, that Ros Kidd spoke about, that you picked up on. This is the repository for it. And it's a curious thing because it's this sort of innocuous piece of parchment now, and until you actually go and sit and read it and pull it apart. And you talk about how you started seeing this connection between black and opium and how odd that was, and you wanted to get to the bottom of it. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, I guess, the lure, because it's been very big for you. It's been a long process, the beginning of this public artwork, finding its rightful home where the document is. It's like the perfect articulation of an idea, but you were like a terrier with it. You got it and you just weren't going to let it go.
Oh, I think I really do have to acknowledge the role that my mother's played in my life. She was always discovering new things. It might be bachelor objects in the South Australian Museum, or it might be a book. So early on in the piece, she liked to read about history in Queensland, and so she actually did put me on to the Way We Civilise. It's just that I was a bit preoccupied with probably making some other work that I didn't come to read the book until a number of years down the track. And with Ros's book, I've read the first 4 chapters, and they just, as the previous speaker, Andrew, was saying, there is such a complexity with race relations here in Queensland that you sort of start to get a bigger picture. And what sort of is also playing out in this scenario is that when I was at school, no one talked about Aboriginal people, or you got very little information about Aboriginal societies in Queensland. You got a very generic education about Aboriginal people who lived in Central Australia. Well, that didn't relate to me. And one of those questions that I did have for my grandmother growing up was, why aren't there any Aboriginal people living on Fraser Island? And she wasn't able to answer that question very well. And so, it's always been this search, like, what happened to Aboriginal people in this country? Why is there difficulty in non-Indigenous Australians forming relationships or conversing with Aboriginal people in this country? What is this denial all about? And then the project came up, and very early on in the piece I suggested and wanted to allude to the Act, and there were opium poppies, 777 of them, in the ceiling. But I was also very shy or reluctant to wanting to identify what the work was really talking about, because previous to this particular project, I have been shut down with public art projects, and I know I'm talking about histories that people don't want to fess up to. So there's a type of censorship that also goes hand in hand with some of these projects. But I was very fortunate that Leah and and other people who were making the decision that this work was important and could have a place here were very supportive of the work, and they have been the whole way through. So it's that type of freedom that I crave as an artist, and not to be shut down or censored. And so, when I was looking at the title of the Act, what struck me hard, as you said, Alison, was the word Aboriginals and opium. Why did those two things go hand in hand? And I think it's a long process. Even when you do read Ros's book, there are things that you start to analyse about the society and the complexity of Queensland's colonial history.
Well, I think it's fair to say, despite Ros's book and Anna and Andrew's work, most of us would be completely unaware of that act had you not made that artwork. I think that's a really interesting thing, how a public artwork, a good one, can articulate a very big idea in a very sort of subtle way as well. Because I think that artwork operates by stealth. And Andrew's saying, when you walk up there, it's sort of, you're not immediately aware of it. The rooms, you could almost pass them, but you have to be inquiring. You have to have an inquiring mind. And we like to think that people who come to a library do have an inquiring mind. They're here to learn and want to know more. But you also talk about how you see your role as an artist as much as about being an educator, that you are someone who is choosing to educate via your art. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I see what I do as a great opportunity. So every time I get a chance through the art world, I use it as a vehicle or a platform to talk about Aboriginal Australia and different facets of history in this country. And possibly growing up with a father who's Irish-Scottish, it's like you always stick it to the English. So, so in our family there was a good, discussion and debate and healthy conversation. So, if you got the chance, you just stick the knife in and twist it a bit. So, I see these public art projects as opportunities to talk about a history that people don't want to face up to in this country. So the other work that's very important for me was the piece outside Brisbane Magistrates Court called Witnessing to Silence, which is talking about 94 different massacre sites here in the state of Queensland. And I had a researcher work on that project and find out for me as many places as she could that were on the public record. And she came up with 94. And that's come about through a long process of understanding that, people, white Australians in this country, still think Australia was settled peacefully. And I know that there was a strong resistance put up. And in Raymond Evans' book, which I wasn't aware of, but only after reading his book, writing about race, fighting words, I think it is, the Butchulla people on Fraser Island put up a 20-year resistance, a guerrilla warfare campaign. Yet I had a curator at an international conference across the road at the convention centre tell all the Maoris in the audience and all the Asians and the Pacific Island people that Australia was settled peacefully. And that played on my mind for a long time, and I wanted to dispel that myth, So the only way that I thought that I could do that was through a public artwork that listed these place names. But when I came to do the work which is called Witnessing to Silence, I did maintain a 2-year silence about what the work was actually about, because I knew it wouldn't get past a 14-panel committee made up of white men in suits. And I was correct. They were balked at the idea of fires and floods, which is how I couched the project. And I didn't reveal the story until the following year. It was about 3 months later, and I had a conversation with my brother Rowan, and I said, do you think I should tell this story now or wait for 20 years and live in New Zealand? And he said, No, you've got to tell that story now. You've got to contact a journalist. So on my right here, I contacted the only journalist I knew at the time, which was Louise Martin-Chu, who was writing for The Australian. And she put me on to another colleague who works out of Sydney, and the story came out in March 2005. But luckily for me, people accepted the work. It wasn't ripped out the next day. But that's, I had to, making this sort of work, I have to think strategically about how am I going to do it, how am I going to accomplish it, and what methods do I need to go through to reach the end final artwork. So I've had to think these things through very clearly, and I think as time goes by, with each new project, there are hurdles and you stumble down here and there, but as time goes by, I think it will get a little bit more easier to tell these stories and put them in the public arena.
I think you showed a lot of courage in that instance and in instances since then. I think that committee process for public art is difficult for many artists, and a lot of artists wouldn't take on the kind of thing that you pulled off there. And as we know, there might be more little exposés to follow, but I don't think any of them are upstairs.
But I wonder, Louise, if I might ask you, we were talking earlier about this notion of the contemporary memorial and how, the idea of what public art has changed quite a lot, even in the time that the term has existed. But also this idea of a public memorial has changed enormously as well. And I sort of feel like you are making these memorials that are very profound and will last. I just wondered if you might have some thoughts on that.
It was interesting, there was an article in The Australian just this week. Joseph Kossuth was quoted just talking about how he saw the role of contemporary art now. And contemporary art's probably never been as popular as it is now. More and more people want to go to exhibitions, see events. There are a lot of you here tonight, and it's Friday. And his thesis about why that was that art's filling a role that really we don't have fulfilled in any other way. Art was, in traditional societies, part of the fabric of society. It doesn't have that role now. We used to have religion to fill meaning systems. Academia is no longer creating systems for people, it's all critiques of other systems. And so he's saying that contemporary art's really stepping into the breach and giving us an experience that is spiritual, emotional, physical, as well as cerebral. It's fulfilling another need that we have. And I think Fiona's work really does take us on a voyage of discovery and tell us narratives that we may not necessarily discover. And when you're sitting in those rooms and you're up close and personal with the art, it's not just the very sinister stories that we've heard from the earlier panel tonight about the role opium played. You're looking at images of the Chinese, of the Aboriginals, and the art itself, these aesthetics, very seductive. So it's a complete experience.
I think that's a good point that you make, because it is very seductive work. There is that thing where you go, oh, it's so shiny, it's pretty. And then you kind of go, oh, well, sorry, I'll read that again. And the same with, like, you sit and look at those beautiful Bodhi leaves. It's a bit trance-like. And I have this idea that people might come to do some serious research and find themselves in those rooms and just taken over a little bit. But I know that that's important to you, that you have a message and it's very profound and it's considered, but there is an aesthetic as well. Like you don't abandon that. And you have talked about the seduction of aesthetics to impart meaning. I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit.
Well, you're aware of your audience, and one of the ways to get them in is through a visual seduction. And it might be, patterns or colours. And so they're enticed to look at the work longer than 3 seconds, I imagine. So it is a ploy that I use in a number of works. It could be photography, public art. The DVD in the Bliss Room is very seductive with the poppies swaying in the breeze, and it gives you a false sense of security in a way, I think. And then once you start to unravel or put the key in the door and unlock it, you start to understand that the work is layered with symbolism and meaning, and when you understand the work, then you start to realise it really does pack a punch. It's just not aesthetically beautiful. There is a deep meaning to a lot of the work that I do, particularly in the public art area.
Mm. And certainly you've had a long career now in public art and made a lot of different statements, but there is this theme, I guess, that runs across it, which is about education and exposing some truths that have just been hidden for a long time. And the work that you've done in Mackay is sort of a bit of a return to some more traditional ideas, but also has these other things running behind it all the time.
I'm just very conscious that, we've written a lot of histories out. We've written Aboriginal people out of our history, and you go to Hervey Bay, there's nothing visually in the landscape that identifies Butchulla people. And so when I've just completed a project in Mackay, the CBD, there was nothing acknowledging Yubira people, there was nothing acknowledging the South Sea Islander community who were blackbirded across from the islands for the sugarcane plantations. And I think this history is very important to be told because, there are descendants of Yubira people living in Mackay, there are descendants of the South Sea Islander people who are not on the radar unless you walk down the street and visually they look different. That's the only way that you are aware of this history. But there's nothing acknowledging that history in any of the literature up there. It's the white courthouse, the historical colonial building over there and over there and over there. It's the white cemetery. And, their historians are writing them in. But black historians are very thin on the ground. So we have to start writing our own people in, I feel. And once it's visually there, it's like, what's this about? So you begin the dialogue, you begin the process of educating people. Oh, yes, we brought people here on these ships on these dates. These are the names of the plantation. Here are the thumbprints of the descendants of these people. This is the historic Leichhardt tree where we used to auction South Sea Islander people off to plantations. So you get that type of discussion going. And I think that's very important that contemporary Australian society today starts to engage with this history before we keep losing it to another generation.
Interestingly, the critic John MacDonald in the Sydney Morning Herald recently described you as an artist who's benefited from being in the right place at the right time. And referred to your status as an Indigenous artist responding throughout your career to a growing awareness of Aboriginal issues. And I wondered, Louise, if you might respond to that, because that seems to me like an incredibly condescending thing to say.
Well, of course, I agree. I agree. And Fiona, as we've said before, has shown tremendous courage in sharing her stories, in digging deep and ferreting out as many stories as she can and putting them on the agenda in places like Mackay where nobody else is working on it. So I think it's a fairly cheap comment.
Is there any final questions perhaps for Fiona? I think that that point that you made just then is very interesting because it's a little bit about, this interest that you have in telling many different stories. This is about the history of Indigenous culture, but there are many things going on. You allow other stories, and you talked about that, Louise, too, that, you can allow other things to be told. You're telling stories that aren't being told. So it's kind of lovely that Bodhi leaf is in there. It's another connection that people might take away. I think, we do have another question. One more.
Just want to ask the question: How is your work? When you do your work, I've seen your work at the Supreme Court, where you're looking at the massacre sites, and I've also been upstairs having a look at your work. But how as an Aboriginal woman and an artist, how has that influenced other Indigenous artists who thrive to get all this work out and shape? How has your work shaped and influenced other Aboriginal artists?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kicked off, as Louise was saying, we kicked off a cooperative in Sydney in 1987, and I think there was a generation of urban artists in Sydney who were, a lot of the people in the group actually did come from Queensland, like Tracy Moffat, Avril Quayle, myself, who were a part of that group. And I think as time's gone on, like we're 2 decades down the track now, there have been other generations of young Aboriginal people who've become involved in the arts. And what you hope for is that you act as a little bit of a role model for other people coming through the ranks. And I think because I've got such determination to tell some of these stories and put them in the public arena, what I'm really trying to say to other Aboriginal people is don't be afraid to tackle this history and put it out there, no matter how brutal it may seem. Once, if you understand and do the research behind it, I think you just have to face people in the eye and say, it's important for me to tell this story now. And I don't care if it hurts your feelings or if you're offended or, you get emotionally upset. This history is very important and people need to acknowledge it and understand it. For too long, Aboriginal people in this country have been written out. That's what I said in my talk tonight. We have to start writing ourselves back in, and for me, art is the vehicle and the platform to do that. And so I do that, and I think it's a legacy of where I come from. It goes back to my mother and my upbringing. I grew up in a family where we were allowed to be very proud of our culture, and we were, my mother reinforced with us, don't let anyone put you down or knock you down. And so I come here with colleagues and I feel an equal, that my story is just important to tell, or this history is just important to tell as anyone else's. So I do use those opportunities, and young people who are choosing to work in the visual arts can see me as a type of role model, I hope, just as they would see Tracy Moffat or Michael Riley as a role model.
And I think that's beautifully put and probably just articulates it all. And it just falls to me to thank Louise very much, and particularly to thank Fiona on behalf of all of us for making such a wonderful artwork and for her contribution to Australian culture. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you.
And it falls to me to do the final thanks. Thanks to our speakers, to our facilitators, and of course to our wonderful Fiona. I'd just like to say a couple of other words, and Fiona's mentioned certainly one person, and I'd like to acknowledge Timothy Hill. Certainly this wonderful building and the wonderful Black Opium and the part that Timothy played has to be acknowledged. So thank you, Timothy. I'm not sure if it's here. And we've heard quite a bit about, it was a 2-stage project. I think at times Fiona and a few of us sort of wondered if we'd ever get the second stage. And I'd have to acknowledge someone in our organisation who never let it go, Tori Jones. Thank you. And of course to Arts Queensland and what was the Public Art Advisory Group that was so determined to make this happen too. Thank you to everyone. So we'd now like you to invite you to go up to level 4 and to actually look at Fiona's work and have some refreshments. Fiona will be up on level 4 and be able to sign copies of the book that's here, the MCA catalogue for Forbidden. And just to remind you, on next Friday night at the UQ Art Museum will be the opening of that exhibition. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the evening.